this is the Green Swans Book Club. Welcome. And this edition, we have Bill Sharpe, who is not only a wonderful human being, but the author of several books and the instigator of one of my absolutely favorite tools to work with in the Three Horizons tool, which, and I'm just going to hold up the book, because if you haven't read it, or if you think it's very thin book, very easy to access, and we'll talk quite a lot about that in a minute. But also other books. This is my next one to read of yours, which is called Economies of Life, Patterns of Health and Wealth, just to tempt everybody else to buy two when they're in the bookshop. And we're going to run this session as we always do, but just slightly differently, in that most of you have been here before and know that Natalie has, for the past year, held the back end of this together, hosted, made sure everybody's questions got answered by, and I read them out. And I've asked her to, on this occasion, to step forward with me and help me interview Bill, because Natalie has worked, again, for the last couple of years with the Three Horizons tool with me, as we at Volans work with it, with both big societal questions, but also with individual companies. So we're going to experiment with having both Natalie and I and Bill chatting about this book, and you guys. Bill, welcome to Green Swans Book Club. You've got, I think, some of the best of our members here. I see lots of people who've been to every single one, and who've been asking for us to feature you and the book, and talk about Three Horizons. So A, welcome. B, thank you for writing the book, because it has certainly made my life a lot better in many ways. But I wanted to start with just a little bit about you, and how did you come to write a book and create this tool? Give us a little background. I know some of it, but not many people will.
Okay, thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone for having me into your book club. It's really nice to meet people who are just interested in the same sort of thing that I'm interested in. The background was, well, you mentioned the most important thing about it is that it's short. And that reflects an intent there, that I'd spent my career in the computer industry, working at the research, development, innovation end of things. And that had caused me to build up practices around working with the future, how to anticipate change. Because when you're as old as I am, you see whole transformations of the industry come along every 10 to 15 years. And so you've had to build up some ways of doing that. And I'd had the good fortune to work with one or two people who are now lifelong colleagues in developing my own practices around scenarios and foresight and so on. And when I came out of the computer industry and started working more on the sort of things that I know all of you on this call are interested in, the global problems that we must tackle, I realized that most people had no tools of that sort at all. And it was quite alarming to realize that you could walk into a senior team in any organization and find that they had no structured way of thinking about the uncertain, unknown future and meeting complexity with some sort of agency. And with the growing sense of the problems, I thought, well, if 10 billion people are going to live well on one planet, how do I share the tools and practices that I've become familiar with all the people like yourselves who need to be equipped with something, and need to be equipped with what a colleague of mine, Graham Lester, who founded the International Futures Forum, called street level practice. What can we use with a stick in the mud outside the village? What's going to be available for everyone to use who doesn't want to become necessarily an expert in these things? The Three Horizons practice itself came about, as most of these things do, more or less by some combination, sort of an accident and desperation. I was doing a piece of foresight work on a government foresight program project in 2006. It was on transport and what we would now call intelligent infrastructure. That's what they called it then. Very complex area. And I was getting a bit stuck. And I was supposed to be writing a technology forward look. And they said, well, can you look 50 years ahead and sort of give us a bit of a roadmap? And I said, no, I have no idea what a roadmap for the next 50 years looks like. There are too many uncertainties. They said, but surely you can. And I went home and in some desperation, sat down and wrote, based on this simple model of three horizons, well, what was the evidence we had of the future? What can we look at out there that will tell us something about what the future will be? And it became apparent that in the natural way I would work on these things, I would go and see who's describing their vision of the future and what are they saying, and supposing they achieve it. That's the sort of evidence of the future. If you tell me you're trying to do something, you may be right, you may be wrong, you may be crazy, but I'd better take what you say as evidence. And I realized that we had a lot of evidence available to us in these three orientations to the future that are there every day in everything. And that was the birth of what became the Three Horizons approach. And then, since it's turned out to be such a simple way of working and that people get it so quickly, and some of my colleagues started finding that they were using it in all sorts of places. It's not often you come across something in your career which just catches on. Usually you're pushing and pushing and trying and it's not working. This was the other way around. People were responding to it and picking it up and using it. So I took a decision that I would just get behind it and see what I could do to get it out there and make it a sort of universal practice, something that everybody had, and that could be a sort of seed for developing a shared practice, a shared culture of futures and transformative thinking that would elevate the impact of all the people like you here who need to come together in complex situations, develop some agency, and elevate the level at which we're all meeting this uncertain future, so that the power of the movement that has no name, as Paul Hawken has it, has an equal power to that of the market, instead of at the moment being sort of trampled by it. So that's been my journey, and that's what I've committed to doing as long as I can keep doing it.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess the second standard question, so it's really interesting to hear you've gone from IT research into changing the world and giving us all this tool. And let's just go back to that and to the book. Is what does the book contain? Very short, because I don't think everybody in the session will have had time to read it. So the briefest of summaries. The
briefest of summaries is that it introduces the Three Horizon way of thinking, which is based on looking at the world as patterns that we reproduce every day as we get up and go about our lives. And the first horizon pattern is the taken for granted everyday pattern that we rely on to keep the lights on and the food in the shops and everything working. The third horizon pattern is the one that might come into being as a vision of the future, to change that. And when we recognize the first horizon is losing its fit to the future in emerging conditions, the third horizon is that we hold as a vision in our minds of the possible future that we or others might bring about. And the second horizon is the entrepreneurial zone, where we move into action, trying something out, grasping the opportunity, trying to shift the system, knowing that most of those attempts will fail, but a few of them will land and become the seeds of the third horizon. So it introduces that way of thinking, gives some case studies, encourages everybody then to start seeing the world in that way. And then the last part of the book explores more the shift in awareness that it might help us cultivate as a shared culture, where we can move into really living in the third horizon in a way that we really all can fulfill our own potential. And how can we access the inequalities that allow us to meet the sort of challenges ahead of us.
I hope you don't mind me jumping in, Louise, but something that you were mentioning there, Bill, when you were talking about patterning, and I think you said it in the book as well, about how you were finding it quite hard to think of a subtitle, or like, why, would you be able to tell us why you chose Patterning of Hope as the subtitle when you were writing?
It was a phrase that just came to me, as sometimes things do, and then you try and understand what it means. So it was sort of that way round. As I was doing this work, I was particularly trying to explore, how do people in the most desperate circumstances sustain hope? What is it that they do to sustain their hope? And I started on the journey that's brought me to this conversation with an organisation called Leaders Quest that one or two of you know really, really well, with Lindsay Levin, because David Levin, for whom I've done some strategy work, introduced me to Lindsay, thought this could be useful to her work in how do we really change business to be a force for good. And she said, well, you better come and see the sort of work we do, and took me off on one of their quests to the Middle East, to Israel, Palestine. And that was a wonderful chance to meet people who face the most intransigent and difficult circumstances every day of their lives, and yet sustain a positive stance and relationship to them. And I found in every case, people did that by just paying attention to the human in front of them and seeing in what way they could renew some quality of life with respect to that person and that situation through some practical sphere of life where they could be the source of that renewal themselves, whether it was a business stretching across the lines or whatever. And so that really summed up for me what I call the patterning of hope, that how whatever the situation, there is some possibility within ourselves to renew the quality of the human there and then. However constrained it might be by other forces, that can never actually be taken away from us. So since then, I've started to really appreciate that for me, hope is what I would call the regenerative virtue. It's the natural quality that we have that we can nourish and that nourishes us to act in any situation.
I love that. The regenerative virtue and nourishing. I would always have said that it was love that was that, but I think that framing it as hope is kind of this future, that there is a future and that good can happen. And maybe just going in a little bit further into the horizons, and so that people get a bit of a sense of how this can be used, because we had Margaret Heffernan in the book club not that long ago, I think maybe January, and she talked about this move from complicated to complexity and why she really loves scenario planning. And could you just outline how you see this as different? Because I know that that's in the book too, why this tool is different to, for example, forecasting or scenario planning.
Yeah, I usually draw a little sort of 2x2 around this, sort of the two dimensions of working on the future. One is, if you ask any group like this, what's the main quality that you associate with the future? Everyone will say some version of uncertain. We don't know what it's going to be. So if we're going to work on the future, we're going to have to handle uncertainty. But then the other one that people don't immediately spot is that even though we don't know what tomorrow will bring, we get up as if we do. We act at every moment with some orientation to that uncertainty. And futures techniques just divide on how they handle that. So road mapping is where you try and, like an engineer, push everything out of the way and say, let's pull people together and plot a path to the future where we can ignore the things that we don't know and focus on the things that we do. That's one way to go. Scenario planning is the other way to go, where you take yourself out of the picture and plot a few alternative stories around the future. Now, what we really need is the ability to put ourselves firmly into the action, but recognize fundamental uncertainty. So we really need to work with both. And that's the domain in which Three Horizons has shown it helps you hold together things you do know, things you don't know, things that are possible and things that are probable, and have a richer conversation around them. Now, there are other approaches like the presence in work of Otto Scharmer, transformative scenarios or normative scenarios of Adam Kahane and Rios Partners are a way to take scenario planning into that space. But the difficulty with them is scenario planning is a long and expensive process. Expensive, literally, you know, it costs a lot to do it usually, but a lot of time, energy and skill to do it well. And people don't have the time or the resource to do it well. And you have to invent a structure every time. And I've done a lot of it. And I know it's real brain bashing stuff to get a new structure out appropriate to the particular topic. Whereas what Three Horizons gives you is that if you've got 2 hours, and often that's all you've got, to get people into some motion on their issue, Three Horizons gets you into that space very quickly. So instead of having to delay everything for a few months while you build up your scenarios, it gives you a ready-made structure, which evidence shows people can use to begin to get their bearings on what they need to do and take the next step into the future. And we call it reflexive futures because it's more oriented to getting into motion, taking a step and seeing what you learn than it is to standing back and producing some scenarios for the next 5 years.
Go on, Natalie.
You sure? Okay. No, I was just going to say that I think the way you phrase it, I really like that, because I think when we think about why we use scenario planning, it's because we're scared of the uncertainty, or we want to try and plan as much as we possibly can. And what's really great about Three Horizons is that although we're still thinking about an uncertain future, it doesn't seem that scary anymore. So I guess my kind of question is, do you like uncertainty then? Do you run towards uncertainty?
Well, I've been testing myself a bit on that this last year or so, because I used to introduce these sessions by telling a story I've put in the book about learning to ski. And I learned as an adult, having done just a little as a child, and I was in the USA, and I booked myself a lesson, and we got on the ski lift with this chap Bud, and as we pulled up and the ground disappeared beneath us, he turned to me and said, "My job is to help people love gravity." and I just thought that was a brilliant way of introducing it, because once you're at the top of the slope and you look down with 2 planks of stuff strapped to your feet, gravity is going to take you down, and so the only question is whether you're going to enjoy it. And enjoying it is about attuning the inner and the outer, so that our inner responsiveness is deeply attuned to the forces at play in the world. And to me, that's just the perfect metaphor for living transformationally. Is the world is always in motion. It's not that motion is something that happens to things in the world that were otherwise stable. No, change is the essential quality. And we're either moving with that in a creative way, or we're sort of resisting it and not in tune with it and suffering, as in we understand now that actually trying to hold on is the root of suffering. We mistake the world. So I would say, yes, I try to teach people to love uncertainty. And I was just reflecting on that today, thinking how well or not I've done on that in the last year or so.
And just picking up on that, can you give us some examples of when people have really not wanted to go there and resisted, with full force? Or have you found, which is my experience, that, as you say, people get the Three Horizons concepts fairly quickly, and suddenly they have a language that opens up kind of new worlds and allows them to step into that uncertainty? That's been my experience, but I'd love to hear if you've had any resistance.
Yeah. One of the most useful aspects of the Three Horizon approach was really described by someone called Jim Ewing, who's done a lot of consulting work. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but he really shifted the way we describe them to being 3 voices that always turn up. And that's really been key to it. We regard the three horizons each as qualities of the future in the present, is the way I describe them, 3 orientations we have. But then also those turn up as 3 typical voices in a conversation. So the first horizon voice is always the incumbent, the voice of power in the system, because that's the way everything's getting done. So a very dominant voice. The third horizon voice is one of a vision, of possibility, of a future that doesn't yet fully exist. And the second horizon, the voice of the entrepreneur. And what we realized was that we typically, in any one situation as individuals, tend to adopt one or other view as being the right one. We identify with it. And so we describe that as a horizon mindset. And the conversation, the typical conversation between the different horizons when they're held as mindsets, is not a productive one. So the incumbent, hearing the visionary walk into their office and say, "I've got a vision of life on Mars," says, "Don't waste my time. I've got my numbers to meet." But that visionary also looks at the first horizon and says, "They're stuck in the mud. They're a dinosaur. They can't see where things are going." And similarly with the second horizon. And the 3 horizon process, when we use it, I expect you found, is once you make people aware that these are 3 perspectives on the world that are all valid, but have a different orientation to the future, then it's at least possible for people to see that we should use them flexibly and not to be bound to their mindset, but recognize the value of each of these perspectives on the future and use them more flexibly. Now, that means, I like to put it, that we disagree a bit more intelligently, not that we'll necessarily agree. And that's a big step forward. However, of course, there are situations where particularly the incumbents will use every technique they can to delay change, even though they perfectly well can understand the perspectives. And I'm sure everyone on this call has situations they're trying to handle where, the incumbents are resisting change, even though the inevitability of it is clear. I mean, that's what we're all trying to grapple with. So Three Horizons, there is a sort of magic about it that it works in most situations to improve the conversation, but it's not that magic. It doesn't automatically reform our human tendency to dig in and resist.
No, but it gives people permission, right, to also to talk about it and to talk about that it's okay to be that incumbent, to be the person who is often finance. And I feel a little bit sorry for finance people in when we do these exercises, because they're kind of, well, you should be, you're keeping the lights on. You're the one saying, no, we can't invest in the visionary plans or whatever. But at least it gives them a reason to be, even when you're doing some future thinking.
Well, yes, and first thing is, we never call anybody an H1 person or an H3 person. The step is to recognize these are different perspectives we can all hold, and that if you're carrying that responsibility for the current system, it's often it is a big responsibility, and you may have to set up a situation where people feel free to explore their own vision and aspirations for the future they hold for their children and grandchildren, without seeming to be flaky and not performing the role of maintaining the existing one. So there's a certain respect that's necessary for that. Yeah. And also, if you're going to realize these visions, in the end, you need the first horizon to turn up. So one way we put it is, to get started in the second or third horizon, you need the first horizon not to say no, to create some space. But actually, to get the job done, you need the horizon one to say yes, to bring its resources and skills and capacities to bear on realizing the future.
Yeah. And one of the things I love is that first, allowing the first horizon to also be to see the people who would normally say, oh yeah, this is me, I need to be there. Because I do think people gravitate to being a person, and we always spend a little bit of time kind of taking them out of that and allowing them to think about the vision and what would they do. And there is that beauty in that, and in saying, hey, the current system, much as a lot of people on this call want to shift the current system, there is a reason we have it, and there are certain good things. And I love that in the book, the sort of the practice of saying, well, what are the things we want to hold on to? We don't want to go backwards, because it just makes that conversation so much more nuanced. As what's good about the current system? What do we need to drag into the new?
Yes, we often find it very helpful, because the natural drawing of Three Horizons, instead of being now, medium, long term, that they're all present across the chart. They're all there. It's just changing the relative priorities that you can often helpfully view it as a sort of foreground background reversal. Yes, we still need the values of the first horizon, but they need to be seen in a bigger context of some new values brought to the fore. So it just takes its place, the current first horizon system, in a more complex and richer worldview.
And
I find it always helpful to look at the third horizon not as a replacement, but typically as in evolution, and move to a higher level of variety and mutuality, a richer, more abundant world, rather than a replacement one. So the old is seen in its role in a bigger world. Sorry, Natalie, I interrupted.
No, that's okay. I interrupted you, Bill. But I was just going to say, I think in the book, I love the way you described the H1 person as the hero, as the person who kind of knows that they're on like the last line, and like they know that their system maybe they're going to keep it going for like as long as they need to be able to have the Horizon 3 come up and be that we need. And I really like that sort of framing of it, because I think, like Louise said, sometimes H1 people, when they realize that they're seen as an H1 person, they get a bit upset by it.
Yes.
But I think you've given us a bit of a perfect segue into a few self-indulgent questions maybe about practical usage, because we at Volans have been using a lot of the Three Horizons framework in our Imaginariums as part of our Tomorrow's Capitalism inquiry. And something that was coming up a few times when we were using the framework with a retail company was that we'd have people come in one day after we taught them about the horizons, and maybe this is like session 2 or something else, and they'll say, I was in this meeting this morning and I was really feeling really H1, and I told myself to snap out of it. And then maybe like the same person the next day will come and saying, oh, I woke up today and I felt really Horizon 3 and it was really great. And so they're really personifying these mindsets. And I was just wondering, is that something that you kind of built into the framework when you were doing that, or was that just an extra bonus?
When I was looking at, was this worth giving it a real push, and I interviewed about half a dozen of my close colleagues who had been using it for a while and seeing what were they seeing. And it was incredibly consistent that 3 things were coming out. One was this very simple structure helped people begin to make sense of complex situations in a slightly more systemic way, so feel that they found their bearings a bit more. The second was that identifying oneself or other people with these horizons came very naturally, which said these really are 3 modes of awareness that we don't have to teach people, they are there. And evidence since has just reinforced that. And third, that the point we were just talking about, that once you reveal both the outer and inner aspects of this, it improves the dialogue that you can have. So to take your point, yes, I absolutely would encourage people to become aware of which one they're using and why. I mean, I've often noticed, because I tend to be always, trying to think about new stuff, like most people, it's quite natural to be on the sort of H3 visionary end. But then sometimes you meet the visionary person and you find yourself obliged to sort of move around the other side of the table and say, now, come on, we need to nail this down, and can we just get on with something, please? And I think, so the whole point is that instead of just being driven by these automatically without thought, we become aware of that. And so in the book, I've used the term future consciousness, that we should develop this awareness of the future potential of the present moment, just like we have an awareness of the past. And in fact, we use the same bit of the brain when we're thinking about the future as when we're accessing our memories. But it tends to be just this fog out there. We haven't realized that we can cultivate this both as an individual awareness and as a shared cultural practice. So the goal here is not only do we learn to use our own awareness, but we learn, like musicians, to come together and play complex music. The Three Horizons is sort of like the stage. So you couldn't play music if you weren't aware of rhythm and pitch and harmony and everything else. So similarly, this is the first step to us becoming much more aware of the rhythm and pitch and harmony of the future.
And just kind of riffing off that music analogy, it's also kind of like you can play different pieces. So in one situation, you may be a Horizon 1 person, and then you can some jazz music and you'll be a Horizon 3 person. And so
exactly.
There's always multiple futures of multiple things going on all the time.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And so just on that as well, as in the book, and I guess it's kind of a theme that we see a lot with the work that you're doing, Bill, is the fact that when we talk about the future, we're seeing multiple futures. So as in even in the International Futures Forum, that's a plural there. And that's something that we've been trialing with our clients as well when we're using the framework, is that maybe we'll brand an Imaginarium as a sustainable future Imaginarium, or we'll trial it as a sustainable futures with the plural. And some people are quite keen to keep that plural, and others are kind of quite keen to only have one future. Was the pluralism, was that a purposeful sort of?
No, it's one of the nasty little secrets that I haven't found an easy way to help people manage the multiple futures aspects. And I've been spending a lot of time on it. But to make it easy, the way I generally do this when it's just doing it as a simple process is to encourage people to populate the third horizon with the visions, plural, that they are aware of. So not just to say what is our vision, but what visions are we aware of that might shape this future? And from that, then explore the agency they want to have. Are those futures we need to contest? Are they ones that we can converge? What's the nature of what's turning up? And if that doesn't happen naturally, then a simple way to do it, I've found, is to get people to brainstorm a list of actors who might influence that future, obvious ones, but also maybe speculative and unusual ones. And then get people to live in that role and do the three horizons from that perspective, and see what turns up, and then bring the different third horizon and second horizon materials together. And that allows you to see, have we got one or more dominant but distinct visions emerging, or is there actually the possibility of converging amongst the different actors? And I find that's a way of working on the aspects of the uncertainty that are really relevant, which is, can we bring the actors together sufficiently to get to the future that we do actually want, bringing back this element that the purpose of doing three horizons is not to insulate ourselves from change, but actually to bring it about.
That sounds like a very neat practitioner backdoor tip that you've thrown us there, Bill. Yeah,
and it's out there in our resource library. Quick plug, if you haven't seen it, the H3 Uni resource library. We call it Multiactor mapping. And again, it came about from some desperation years ago when I was doing scenario planning.
Well, I'm sure we'll find that link, and we'll send it out to the book club afterwards as well. But kind of why, I guess, maybe on that, why you needed the resource library in the first place. What's kind of the most difficult context you've had to run a Three Horizons exercise in?
Oh gosh. Wow. There are a couple. I mean, what I thought was going to be the most difficult, and it relates to this, was that very early experience of being taken to Israel-Palestine with Leaders Quest. In fact, and they said, would you like to run a workshop with us there, with some young leaders of One Voice, the organization that brings together young leaders from the two communities. And I was a bit daunted by that. But in the end, it turned out it was just one side. It was the Palestinian young leaders. But that was really interesting experience for me, because we did a Three Horizons on the future of the Middle East the first day. And then the second morning, we got them to do this role play. So we said, look, in your environment, who are the most dominant players? Obviously, Israel and Syria and other countries around them. And we divided them into teams to role play what they thought those groups would see as their own Three Horizons. And that really impressed me, that they were able to really inhabit those points of view seriously and properly, and do it really well. So, and then they could look at, well, what's the third horizon vision that brings these different points of view together? So we, instead of having competing visions, we might find where the common ground is. So that was, I anticipated great difficulty, and it wasn't as difficult in that sense as I thought. The one that nearly did for me was a few years ago working on carbon pricing, and it was a mixed Three Horizon scenario planning exercise, and it was just very, very demanding. And it was just it was a bit too complex to manage with the tools and team that we had. So it wasn't really I don't know where we want to go with this right now, but that was the one where I had to marshal all my inner strength to get through it.
So do you think it's about the framing of the question and the team in order to make this as successful as possible? Because I know one of the things we do, we spend a lot of time before people arrive in an Imaginarium or whatever situation we're using the tools on kind of getting their mindset, thinking about the future, thinking about different, sort of taking different orientations, just considering,
Yes.
So is it that getting the team in the right space, or is it the framing? Because it's really interesting to hear that carbon pricing, not surprising that would be very difficult to do, but
yeah, I don't really want to go too much on to that one, except that part of the difficulty was it was a deeply technical domain, and it turned out we hadn't quite got our hands around the expertise to mobilize into the work in quite the way that would have helped, as well as having a lot of difficult dynamics in the team. So I think, as you're saying, one of the things I've noticed trying to bring these simple approaches into use is that there's sort of an over reliance on the meeting, the workshop, without enough attention to the process that leads up to it. Whereas in traditional futures work, because you tend to lay it out as a big project, you can do a lot of work on that framing and scoping and expectation setting before you get into any workshops, and then work in between. And I think that one of the biggest areas I have to pay attention to and encourage people on in Three Horizons is, don't think that scoping the workshop is just an easy thing to do. You might need to spend a lot of time interviewing the key stakeholders and clarifying the scope of inquiry before you convene people into a workshop. So yes, I think that's really important.
It's one of those, it's such a simple tool to adopt and for people to do. As you say, you don't need more than a few hours to get something really valuable out of it. But again, then the risk is people think they can just walk in completely cold, where there is value in that whole process piece.
Sure. There's quite a lot of art in setting a good scope, and people always want to make it as big as possible, and I always want to make it as small as possible, so we sort of can get a grip on it to begin with.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry for that scary question, Bill.
Sorry. I've got my management worst notebook here if we really want a few more.
I'll try and be nicer. Sorry, it's my first time here. But in our briefing, to move us to nicer territory, you were telling us about this wonderful project that you're working on in Bristol. Would you be able to share a bit more with the book club about what we're doing there?
Oh, yes. There's a place in Bristol called the Watershed. It's an old building down on the docks, and it's an independent cinema and cafe bar and all the usual things you'd expect there. But it's also behind the scenes something called the Pervasive Media Studio, which is a creative innovation space which brings together the local universities and local companies and artistic people to do really media-led innovation. And have been working on their approach to diversity and inclusion, because although they have a very big presence in Bristol, they realized there were really sort of boundaries that they weren't managing to cross. And they got a small grant from the National Lottery's sort of Building Back Better program last summer to explore what we called equitable futures. How could they build an approach that got them out from underneath patriarchy and capitalism and all the other isms and anarchies that are holding them back. And I had the good fortune that they asked me to work with someone called Zara Ash Harper, who is a producer of inclusion. So she's a Black woman, and her practice is to work with organizations to overcome these boundaries to inclusion. And so we've been working together to explore how could we use Three Horizons, the Watershed we're already very familiar with, but use it in the context of exploring these systems of exclusion and how would we perhaps make progress on them. And the really interesting thing for both of us has been, I didn't really know how I'd use Three Horizons on this, because the systems are all about the inner attitudes that we bring. And what would I write on a post-it? What was going to make sense? But it turned out a lot of the value happened before we got into any of those discussions, in the way that it supported Sarah in having a container for the work. What she'd found is that up to this point, doing inclusion work, she could take an organization on a journey and help them really improve the way people were coming into the organization. But in a way that already had a barrier in it. People were being included in a system that wasn't changing. And by having the organizational level visible through Three Horizons, she could bring that work with the individuals and what level of challenge all the people were up for into the context of the journey the organization needed to go on, and could calibrate the level of challenge that people were ready for. So instead of doing our usual first horizon, third, and then second, we started with the third horizon and building a sense of what would be a richer, more inclusive future where everybody was moving into that future together. And then from that could look back and see for everyone, what did they need individually to give up to be on that journey, and how they might start to build the growth points of that in the second horizon. So this has been really exciting for me to be on this, because I'd never done anything like this before. And I really wasn't at all certain that Three Horizons would have a lot to offer into it. And yet we found it really does, yet again, hold up under this very different set of needs.
Very interesting. And I guess maybe from the things that we've learned from the past year and a half with coronavirus and with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, and how our system like even the system that we think we want to change in the horizon threes that we're potentially looking for may still not be fit for purpose. How do we start including more of that messiness and building in more of those? Is it either creating more horizon threes when we're thinking about horizon threes, or is it shooting even further ahead to like an ultimate vision of the future?
I'm very much learning my way into this space, but to me, how we create common ground is probably the most important thing to work on because of this increasing polarization. At one point when Zara and I were working together, we used the analogy that if you're going in for an operation, you need both the surgeon and the anaesthetist. You know, it's not a good idea to not have one or the other, because our skills were very complementary and different. She's one of those people who has an absolutely acute sensitivity empathetically to what's going on for people in the room, whereas I don't. And I rely very much on other people to help me with that, to see what, but I listen very carefully to what people are saying, and I can understand the structures that they're working with. And we found those two skills together were both necessary. So as I said, Three Horizons just provided the container. When we had 5 workshops, and the first 3, we didn't use Three Horizons at all. I think it was that way around, certainly the first 2. And when we did, the things we wrote down were sort of simple and straightforward. But she said, but the point is, we've never done those things before. Yes, they're simple and straightforward. And really all the skill had been her skill in bringing people along through a set of exercises where people could become aware of the journey they needed to be on in an atmosphere where hurt could be expressed and held, and no positions need to be taken. And as Louise was saying, love, we could learn to love. And rather than having to learn to love everybody in the world, we could just take that cohort and learn to love each other. So we'd convened a microcosm of the system, people who represented all the views, and went on a journey together. Now, we made a conscious choice in putting that together, that we recognize that, particularly because it was experimental, that there are people who aren't up for the journey. There are people who are already deeply polarized and for whatever reason can't come on that journey yet. So we worked with people who we knew understood the issues, had experienced them in their own lives, but were very much on board with being part of that process if it could be made to work. What we do from there to really take that to the full depth and polarity of the society, I really don't know yet. That's a journey for me.
I think it's a journey that we're all on. And something when I was reading the book, when we got to the case studies, was that it really resonated with me that in each example, one of the linchpins of the solutions that all the organizations were coming to was around community and everybody working together. Is that something that you see as a central focus in the framework?
Yes. I found myself needing to come up with a term or a word in our language that we don't really have in the way that we talk, but the African notion of Ubuntu, we are, therefore I am, expresses, and it's what I call mutual qualities of life that you can only have because you have them with other people. So language is such a quality. We only have a human language because we join a community of speakers from the moment we are conceived to coming into life, and we have to grow into that community. And because we don't have a common term for that, it's hard to bring it into view. But really, having a life is having these mutual qualities of life, whether it's music or love. Love is the deepest example, where our experience is the more fully we are part of the whole, the more fully we realize ourselves. And the more fully we are ourselves, the more fully we realize the whole. So the third horizon, the depth of life, is where we don't experience a tension between being for ourselves and being part of the whole. And that's when we are deeply part of this, what I would call a mutual quality of life. So really what I'm trying to do is cultivate an understanding of this mode of awareness and consciousness in which we are always living in the flow of shared life.
Can I pick up on that, Bill? So you've referenced that a couple of times, this combination of inner and outer consciousness or work and patterns. Just talk a little bit more to that. if you could. I'll just leave it open like that if I can.
Yeah.
Because somebody, I think actually Tamsin said it in the chat very early on, which was great. She said, I'm going to find it. Oh, there we go. So it's much, this is fabulous, it makes much more versatile what might be mistaken for a strategy tool for a much more mindfulness awareness tool, which is, I think, beautifully said. Thank you, Tamsin, for putting that in there.
Yeah.
I want to use it as a provocation for Bill to talk to that. What is this? You know,
yeah.
Are you telling me that we walk in and do strategy and future sessions with our clients with a mindfulness tool?
Yeah, it's funny because just a month or two back, I was working on another tool I use in this space. Talks about government. You know, every problem comes down to bringing into line the sort of policy level, the business level, and production and community and everything else. And I sort of suddenly came out in a rash every time I used the word strategy. I just thought, I'm just sick to death of the word strategy. And I realized that while government and governance is about policy and business is about strategy, that's really where the word sits, business strategy. What's the word for community? What word describes getting a community into action? And just for now, I've settled on social action, but I'm quite happy to turn the question back to you lot and say, what should we use for the mode of output of that process of community oriented, direction? Yeah.
Let's just pause for a second there and see if everybody's still awake and thinking, because I know that several people, I'm looking at Rajan and Tina in particular, I know that there's going to be some brilliant. So the question is, if government policy is to government, strategy is to business, what's the word?
X is to community, yeah.
Exactly.
And society. What is it?
Solidarity. Nice, Tom. Yes. Thank you. Just going to take a few seconds on this one. Volans team, you're welcome to also join in the chat.
Communing, yeah.
Communing.
And I want a word that has a sense of taking action as well, which is, you've looked at some situation and you want to act, and policy and strategy have that element of we're going to do this, act in this way, agency, community. Yeah, so it's a form of agency. It's the distinctive form of agency that belongs to community.
Is it collaboration? Like, collaboration doesn't feel quite good enough.
Balancing, yeah, that's a nice one. I offer this as a party game you can play on. You can all email me as often as you like, and we'll see what we all end up on.
You all thought you were coming to listen. Now we've got some action. You may end up in Bill's next book, or certainly in the next version of a workshop.
So did I address what the question was? I've lost track. Sorry.
So it was around this, strategy and mindfulness, I guess.
Oh, with mindfulness, yes.
Like that, empowering, mobilizing.
Yes, I call this sort of stepping into future consciousness. We are trying to awaken. And a step in consciousness, the way I think of it, is that we bring to the aware mind something that is already natural to us, and then it becomes available to us. So definitely, this sits within an understanding of mindfulness, and in particular, it means becoming aware of the conditioned patterns of our lives. So the first step is awareness. The first step is realizing that we are living patterned lives and that we can easily identify with those patterns, and that if we do, then we're going to suffer because the world is constantly changing. So then we have to become open to transformation. So the second step is being willing to live in flow rather than holding on to any one ground stability that we might have. And to achieve that flow, we have to be constantly resolving the tension between being for myself and being part of the whole. So that willingness to live from the perspective of hope and love, so that I'm constantly in flow and can meet change with a sense of life. For me, the essential nature of hope is being able to meet the future, whatever it costs me. to have a sense of life, even in the presence of death. Whereas despair and depression come from an experience of death in the midst of life. That, to me, is what it's like to suffer despair, is when we are in life but do not feel alive.
That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm seeing nodding heads around the table, the virtual sofa table. Thank you. Because there is something really interesting. And again, I guess, I tend to talk about us being, very actively in that second horizon, in the messiness, in the transition, where we'll see both opportunities for change, and the vision's not quite there, and we're kind of grasping at it. And one of the things Richard and I talked about the other day in the office was this combining of strategy and humanity. And I sometimes wonder how, because you can present Three Horizons as a tool, but as you say, if it requires an inner practice or a shift in the mindset, how much does it require that shift in the mindset for people really to grasp it, and how much does it contribute to that shift that needs to happen?
Yeah. This is also speaking to your previous question. I think for people, like I think most people on this call would be, who are active in trying to help other people in one way or another, there's a particular requirement that we do the inner work, so that I think you can only safely evoke in others what you've become aware of in yourself. Otherwise, you're in dangerous territory. And because you don't know how to create the container for, or you might be projecting into others things that you haven't worked on in yourself. Now, we're all going to be doing that at some level, but we owe it to others to become aware as we can of that. So that's, for instance, by working with Zara on the inclusion work, she could safely take people to points of challenge that it wouldn't be appropriate for me, because I wouldn't know how to do it and how to make that a safe experience for people, whereas she does. So I think we need to do that work for ourselves. Now, what I've found is Three Horizons seems to just work, as you're finding. So I feel very relaxed about just saying to people, look, there's a sort of fairy dust here. It's not going to do any harm. And what other futures people have found is that it does orient people to a more systemic awareness without having to beat some heavy drum about what systems thinking is. And what I've tried to do very consciously in everything around Three Horizons is to make it as neutral as possible, so that other practices can be brought in and be used in relationship to each other. So you get to make the choice on what inner work do these people need to do to be brought to some sort of change that is necessary in this situation, and have we brought the right skills to bear to do that. So, just like I don't try and lead on that inclusion work, deep conflict situations are not my skill. They are for other people. They know how to prepare the ground.
Yeah.
So I think if the fundamental practice that underpins all this is what, in a rather clumsy phrase, we call participative repatterning. Transformation is about repatterning our lives, changing the patterns of viability and identity. That's what transformation is, changing the patterns of viability and identity. Well, that's how I think of it. And that's always going to involve developing some awareness internally to be on that path. How deep that is and how challenging that is going to be situation specific. And my goal is that through keeping this framework very open, different people with different skills can be brought in. So back to the surgery example, you may need a team of 8 people to manage the risk of taking somebody sort of more or less apart for a few hours and putting them back together. And you better have all the skills in the room and know just what you're doing.
Brilliant.
And just on that awareness, Bill, because in the book you have so many different analogies from so many different sectors, from the music analogy to the caterpillar. I think there was one where you got lost at a cliff with a dodgy GPS.
Yeah.
There's like a wealth of experience and awareness that you have when it comes to helping us understand what you mean by the three horizons. How much life experience has there been? And is the three horizons, is it something that, a bit like, say, if I went out and bought a pair of new trainers, I'd suddenly see everybody on the street wearing my same pair of trainers and I wouldn't have noticed it last week before I got them? It's like one of those things where once you're aware, you just have that awareness forever.
I don't think my life experience is particularly broad. I've had a happy life in many ways, and I've had a few challenges like everybody. But I look at many of you on this call, some of you I know and most of you I don't, but I know that there's a huge wealth of experience that's quite foreign to me here. And my real goal has been really that we should regard every human being as a unique practitioner of third horizon thinking, because each one of you is going to give a unique meaning to what it is to live a human life. And nobody is going to reproduce that, and nobody else can lead in the way that you can lead, showing the possibility of a life in a particular sort of way. So you've got a wealth of experience too. It's different to mine. So we're not trying to take over each other's experience and use it any more than we should try and take over each other's love of music or experience. I see Rajan here, and I've heard him once or twice get off on a riff of the things he knows about music, and I'm just sitting there thinking, wow, I don't. That's really extraordinary. And we're never going to copy one another's experience. So the real challenge is to create a meeting point where the different embodiments of the future are each fulfilling each other. That's what living in the third horizon means. And we'll each have our own funny little examples of, tripping over the dog or whatever it is.
Great. And I think that's the perfect moment, because it looks like the chat is suddenly now kicking off and we're getting lots of questions. So do keep them coming. We've got Bill for another half an hour, so we'll try and squeeze as many questions as we can. But the first one is coming from Teen. She says, Bill, I love the book, and it was my first investigation of the three horizons concept and practice. I'm very short-sighted, so I was always thinking of things in terms of when the optician puts those lenses in front of your eyes to determine how you can get clarity of vision. Is it that the three horizons are all of those lenses put in different combinations depending on the situation in order to have one focus at any given moment?
Yes would be a simple answer. The longer answer is, there was a particular moment when I was struggling with the book because I felt I didn't know enough about transformation. I'd come from a different sort of world, and I got together with my colleagues who, in the International Futures Forum, just half a dozen, and we had a workshop day on what I was trying to do with it. And Maureen O'Hara, who is a very experienced psychologist, psychotherapist who worked with Carl Rogers, said, what you're really doing is developing a step in consciousness. And I realized then that really was what it was about, and that three horizons is like a really simple step. And I tried to think of it. Imagine that we were humans back at the time when language was just emerging, what that must have been like. When we, to say the cat sat on the mat would have been quite an advanced thing to do, and then people say, oh, yeah, you can say, and the dog's sitting over there. And, you would start to say a few things and we'd start to get the hang of it. And then life then circulates through that and it takes off. And every life brings something different to bear. And yet it's a mutual quality. It's a shared thing. Nobody tries to pin it down. And I'm thinking of three horizons like that you were saying, when you've got it, does it do its magic? And I think, well, it seems to. It seems to set us off on a path where you can deepen your understanding of the flows of the world, the different qualities of pattern. And instead of just sticking to that really simple model, you start to work away and get deeper perspectives. So it's not just those three. You start to see other things going on and a deeper understanding of the patterning of our lives. And at the back of the book, I've started to sketch out what I call my regenerative compass. So, different qualities that underpin different modes of awareness. but anchored in the three horizons. So the short answer is yes, just try and use the three horizons, but then allow yourself to really ponder and deepen where it takes you.
I think that's one of the notes I wrote in my book when I was reading it, was that I'm becoming more aware of what I know I don't know, or like the unknown unknowns.
Yeah, and how to meet those creatively. Because that's what life is. Life is always making the unknown known. It can't help but do that.
Right. So the next question is actually about Horizon 2, which you haven't really talked much about. I think we've been spending a lot of time in H1 and H3. So this question's from Tasman. She says, so interesting to think about transformation and hope. Looking at resilience, I've been struck by the fact that the word transilience is about transformation and leaping forward. I'm sorry if I butchered that word, Tasman. Do you think we should be trying to raise awareness of the horizon of resilience? The fact that there is a way to hold ourselves together as we envision and regenerate the future pattern?
I'm not sure whether I'm going to fully understand the question, but let me give a start and then be happy to take a second go. You're right, we haven't talked much about the second horizon yet. And one of the useful things in three horizons is the distinction we make between H2 plus and H2 minus. And it just means that some steps into this messy middle are liable to be captured by the first horizon to prolong itself, and others act as seeds of the new pattern more effectively and lead us on to the third. Resilience often has a meaning which is sort of H2 minus. It's how do we ensure that communities can, for instance, can recover from flooding, get back everything to normal, get back to normal as quickly as possible. So have the capacity to absorb shock and repair and recover, which is of course really important in all sorts of respects. But the other meaning of resilience that my colleague Tony Hodgson uses is what he calls bounce beyond, where instead of bouncing back, we bounce beyond, and we use the emergence of crises to make a step into the new pattern that we need, that will allow us to move to a better level of resilience, a more transformative model, or regenerative model, people would say now, where we can not just bounce back to a model that isn't working, but step forward into something that is in tune with the emerging conditions. I don't know whether that at all addressed the question. I'm not sure that it did, but I'm happy to take a second go at it.
Yeah, I'm just having a quick search for Tasman to see if I can find her. If maybe, Tasman, if you want to unmute.
Okay, this is Tamsin's question in the chat, is it? I can read it, yes. Means to bounce back, to rebound, to return. Leap across transition. To new state. Yes, so that's the difference between H2 minus bounce back and H2 plus bounce beyond. Yes. Yes.
We did it, Bill.
Yeah, so look at H2 plus and minus as the way I would capture those two meanings.
Mm-hmm. While we're on Horizon 2, is there anything else that you want to take us through a bit more in your thinking of an H1 capture and the positive?
Well, yes. The essence of acting in the second horizon is what I like to call the act of creative integrity, creating a new whole pattern. Lots of activity, particularly in the non-profit sector, the NGO sector. I've heard people say, look, we've been doing good projects for 20 years, they met all their KPIs and we haven't changed a thing. And entrepreneurs often talk about their minimum viable product. What can we get out in the world, like the first web browser or the first Amazon web page, which is really simple, but has in it the essence of the new as a pattern. And my analogy for this is, the caterpillar that's going to become a butterfly. And all a caterpillar can actually do as a caterpillar is keep getting bigger. It just keeps eating, as my wife frustratingly tells me, it eats the cabbage. To get to being the butterfly, it has to pupate. And when it pupates, it has to let go of who it is and become this sort of goo. And I often think, what would it be like, actually feel like to be a caterpillar, going into that goo? But what I love is that biologists tell us that the new structure comes from a set of structures that are called imaginal cells and imaginal discs. And what they do is they form a new set of relationships amongst themselves in the middle of this goo that's now been released from the existing caterpillar. And it's that new set of relationships from which the new pattern then grows. So I like to call that the minimum viable pattern. And the step of creating that, the step of creative integrity, integrity is wholeness, is that commitment to creating that new pattern in the world. However small it might be, we have some capacity, acting from hope and love, to take a little step and to be the start of that set of imaginal cells. And then we enroll others into those relationships. And from that enrollment, it's the new pattern that can grow. So the sociologists tell us there are 3 stages of a transformation. There's the envisioning, bringing to mind, using our imagination to see that world. Then there's enrollment, which is this step of creating the relationships that actually start to embody it in the world. And then there's mobilization, where from that enrollment, more and more resources come into play. And eventually we shift the resources out of the first horizon into the third and build the new normal. So yeah, the second horizon, the critical step is that commitment, making it visible as a new pattern in the world, such that resources can flow into it and other people can be enrolled into it.
I can see you looking like you're about to go, Louise.
No, I was just nodding. I like those steps with the enrollment and the patterns. I think Horizon 2 doesn't get quite enough praise sometimes.
Well, it's where the action is.
Exactly. And as I said, it feels like that's where a lot of the work is right now, is a lot of people are fairly sort of in agreement about what Horizon 2 should look like. But it's the how to get there, and the discussions of, if you don't have the perfect solution, how do you take that first step? And that's, I very much see that as a gift of the entrepreneur, and the Horizon 2 action is being willing to do something that hopefully won't get captured, but maybe the seeds of the future that a future we won't see unless we actually take action. And I guess I sit very much in the cheerleaders for action on that front.
The challenge of being a second horizon entrepreneur is that most of those are going to fail. So while society wins out overall from lots of people trying, if you have to be up for the fact that you might be one of the ones that doesn't make it.
No, exactly. Picking up on something you said earlier, being able to adapt. And transform yourself to that third horizon as it comes. But
when I became a research manager in Hewlett-Packard, the senior manager says you have to recognize that you've got to motivate people through the fact that 3 or 4 out of 5 of the things that we do here in the research labs won't ever make it into the business. Yet you've got to stay motivated.
Yes. I worked in a place where we talked about, with ideas, it was about, being willing to kill your babies, constantly reviewing, is this work continuing, which is just such a horrible image. So I'm going to turn to, I see Tom has put a question in, actually, which feels very relevant. Which is, to what extent do you need to understand or know about Horizon 3 to be an H2 plus entrepreneur rather than an H2 minus entrepreneur? So again, H2 plus being creating something entrepreneurial that would be a seed for Horizon 3 versus something that could be captured and actually extend the life of the current system that we are hoping to change.
I think if you haven't got a sense of the vision that you're aiming for, then it's very easy to get the second horizon innovation wrong in that sense, in that you may not really understand what is the seed of that third horizon shift. A colleague of mine was giving an example. I probably won't be able to bring it to mind very well, but he was looking at the way the movie makers had responded to the need to bring in not just men as heroes, but to bring in women as heroes. And some did it in a sort of mechanical way. Okay, let's have a woman Superman or something. And it was just like well, what's this about? Whereas the successful ones thought about, what is it? What's the shift we really need to make here? And then worked from that, and has been much more successful. So if you just do it in a sort of pattern shifting sense of, okay, we need to do something that's oriented to the future, you may not really hold the essential shift in mind that you've got to make.
Great question. Thank you, Tom.
And so I think from the last hour or so, I think we've all become pros at Three Horizons 101. And I was looking in the chat and I see that John's got a few questions, and it kind of sounds like advanced Three Horizons. So we're going on to level 2. And so his first question, I'll read both of them out, but I think they're interlinked. So the first question is, some of the renderings of the third horizon show it taking off, going higher. What does Bill think of that? And then the second question is, in most versions, the Three Horizons achieve equal heights before falling back. In some, the third horizon breaks out, goes higher. Any thoughts? So I think it's about kind of, we see this perfect vision, or we have the idea of the Three Horizons when we draw it out is always that first horizon, that perfect arch down, and the third going up, and the two doing a nice hump in the middle. Yeah. It doesn't always look like that.
No, and the encouragement is to use your imagination and sketch. So some people draw it without actually thinking about what they're doing by having humps go up and down, and sometimes that's a little bit irritating that people don't seem to have thought about it very much. But hey, you know, but on our resources website, and there's a little document I could point you to later on. We've got 4 variants or archetypes that we use to stimulate different ways of looking at the horizon. So the conventional 3 things is just, let's suppose there's this rather smooth transition with a peak of innovation in the middle. We've got one for Horizon 1, what we call H1 capture, which shows the first horizon capturing the innovation that's come along to keep itself going. There's a couple of wavy lines that go across the page, while the third horizon grows more slowly in the background. And an example of that would have been the way when the first web browsers came out. I was in the industry at the time, and there was assumption that that would quickly displace the desktop operating system. Well, it didn't. Microsoft was able to capture that innovation very successfully for quite a long time, until what we called Web 2.0 in the background was developing and finally came through as a fundamentally new architecture that would displace the central role of the desktop operating system. So that draws the lines in a different way. H1 overshoot is when, as you would suggest, if I were to draw it like that and crashing, that's Detroit in the car industry. H1 just thinking the future is just more of the same and going up to the right until it fundamentally goes off a cliff and crashes. And you could argue at the moment, you know, our current human economy is dangerously perhaps close to being in H1 overshoot. And then you may find you're in a very difficult place marshalling the resources to regrow the third horizon. And then our last one is the H2 investment bubble. Again, I lived through the dot-com boom and bust, and it could easily happen in renewables, that everyone suddenly gets so panicked that we try and dump all the money in the world on the second horizon, and it becomes a bubble, an investment bubble, a speculative bubble. And that's when the second horizon actually can't absorb all those resources fast enough. And when we did the carbon pricing scenarios, that was one of the things we did identify was a danger, that if everyone says, yes, we must disinvest from fossils, and immediately does so and tries to put all the money straight into the renewables, we could have actually had a very dangerous situation where a lot of the economy would crash because we couldn't absorb all that investment, and we again could find it hard to recover. But the dot-com boom and bust was one of those. I lived through that and suffered it.
Well, no.
So you'll find these online, we call them variants or archetypes, and the encouragement is to play around with the meaning of shifting the shapes and seeing what they suggest to you.
And I guess we know that the framework is really helpful to help us picture the future and the present. But from what we were kind of talking about there, is it also helpful as a kind of backcasting tool, or kind of does it help us does it help us retrospectively look at real-time examples of when there have been Three Horizons scenarios in the past?
I think you've got maybe got two thoughts there. One is, it is helpful often to look back as far as you want to look forward, and get a feel for the time constants of the change that you need to work on. Is this the sort of thing? When did the first horizon come into being? Like in the UK, you'd say, well, our current welfare and national health, that's a post-war thing. It's taken this long to come into being. How long, what sort of processes of change might we need to think of? Are they decades or centuries? Looking at agriculture and land use, I was doing that recently, and somebody said, well, you really need to go back to human settlements and first agriculture to get a feel for how deeply embedded that pattern is in our culture. Or in computing, it's 10 to 15 years. So looking back to look forward is quite helpful. And then I find the easiest way to wrap up a Three Horizons workshop when you've built your map is to get people to tell the story looking back from the future. And we use a very simple model from How to Pitch a Story from the Pixar people. Every day, once upon a time, every day, the H1 pattern was doing what it always did, until one day our hero or somebody stepped out and created a minimum viable pattern. And because of that, things started to move in H2. And because of that, fundamentally, things shifted overall until finally we all lived happily ever after in this new third horizon. And if you've got nothing better at hand and you've got to get through a workshop in 2 hours, I can tell you that works pretty well because the human mind loves stories, and you give people this structure and people just build it. And then of course it's trivial, but because it's trivial, they can remember it. And then you can read the newspaper in the morning, online or whatever. And it's this, what we call cognitive priming. Once you've entertained a possibility as a reality, you see in the environment signals that it could actually be happening. So the point is not to say that the whole process of messy change can be boiled down to a Pixar story pitch, but it gives us what I call a sort of an imaginary island to navigate with. We can hold it in mind as a navigational tool to inquire into what's really going on.
And for me, this is a kind of, I know we're not quite at time yet, but it's a perfect circle because it brings us back to hope, right? When you told that Pixar story, I thought, oh yes, that gives me hope that the heroes are stepping up and that we all live happily ever after. So actually picking up on that, one of the things that I wanted to make sure we cover, and Natalie may have other questions, but was, and we're really thrilled to be, to have had you come in and do some teaching of our team and been able to kind of go on this journey with you and inspired by you. And you're building a network of practitioners. And I just wondered whether you want to just make sure we get that in. No, I'm seeing more questions now. But I wanted just to talk about that because I'm excited about that and to work with you on that. So
yeah. So with my colleagues, we're creating this Creative Commons approach. My ambition has been that there should be a commons of practice because the goal is that we all have a shared language, all the things we've been saying. We've created our minimum viable pattern, a little online resource library. We're now, with the organisations such as yours, with whom we've sort of built up some shared practice, wanting to launch from Future Stewards, the Practice Network, very much with the idea that there are organisations who themselves are highly networked and can spread the practice, and that each different one will maybe bring a different speciality and take these shared tools at the core and then add to them the ones that are particular to their networks and their practice and their skills, as it might be inclusion or reinventing capitalism or working on policy in developing countries, whatever it might be, is going to need another set of wrappers. So the idea is that there's a common core, and a common core that supports the practice of facilitation, leading these conversations as expert practitioners, and is available to everyone. And the ambition is, how do we get to 100 million of the next generation? That would be 1% of a 10 billion population. And I reckon if, that's 2 to the power of roughly 27, and we're, 6 or 7 years in, so we can probably do it before I start poking up crocuses, before.
Definitely.
Yeah.
No, I think it's such an important tool, and again, building that community of practice. So yeah, anyone on the call who are interested, either go to we can start with the university website. We'll post
Uni,
that. H3 Uni, or get in touch with us and we'll direct anybody in the right direction for that. So that was my kind of, I wanted to make sure we got.
Thanks for getting that in. Future Stewards is going to relaunch itself with a new website quite soon, and that'll be part of this soft launch of this network in time for COP.
Wonderful.
Exciting. So I also had a bit more a final, hopefully we can squeeze it in. It's a bit of a meaty question, but it's one that I've been really interested, and it comes in near the end of the book, which is why I've been holding myself back from it. But I could hear little snippets of you mentioning bits about it too, Bill. But I wondered if you could tell us, at the end of the book, you talk about imaginary islands and your regenerative compass. And if there's time, I was wondering if you could talk us through your visioning around that as well.
That's rather a lot in a short time.
I know, I'm sorry.
I'll just talk about the regenerative piece first, and maybe that. Between the first edition and the second edition, looking for language, I always try and look for language that can help people orient to what we have to do as simply as possible. And the regenerative term has really come into use, I'm sure, as many of you will know, in our field of what is the third horizon that we're aiming towards, and that resilience and restoration and so on are not enough. They don't meet the case, that we have to bring human life and economy back into a positive relationship with the biosphere, so that each is actually supporting the other. And I've adopted a very simple definition or understanding of what do we mean by regenerative, and said, you can't be regenerative on your own. A system is regenerative with respect to the other systems of which it is a part. So always understanding, saying the meaning of regenerative is that you have only positive externalities. That's a very precise definition that you can use, because you can say, with respect, here's the system I'm interested in now with respect to other communities or other scales up to the planet. Am I in a positive relationship with them, and are they with this system? So I offer that simple definition of regenerative systems as the core of what we're aiming for in the third horizon. The idea of the imaginary islands was just a story I love that perhaps we can finish on, which is the navigation of the Pulawak sailors in the Pacific Ocean, where they have these deep cultural practices of navigating across the open seas. And just imagine setting out in the Pacific Ocean in some tiny little craft. And they taught first, of course, the layout of those islands that there are and where they are and how soon you'll come across them and where they should appear and so on. And using the stars and so on. And then because there are places where the islands are there, but they'll be over the horizon. You're taught, well, those islands are there, and you can just remember that those islands are there and be bringing to mind the pattern of islands that you can't see. And you think, well, that's pretty smart, using islands that you can't see. And then it says, well, and often there are no islands there at all. And so they make them up. And you thought, I was with you up to this point, but how did it get easier to navigate by making up imaginary islands in the middle of the Pacific? What's going on here? And the answer was that by holding these in mind, it helps you interpret the many clues of wind and weather and tide and the creatures that you see at the sea and the birds that you see. So it's sort of a mental scaffolding for the many clues that you've got to hold in mind. And so what I've done in the book is just offered four imaginary islands for our navigation to a regenerative future. But I think I'm going to say, if you want to know what they are, you're going to have to read the book.
Read the book. That was a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you to everyone for joining Green Swans Book Club today. Yes, any questions you haven't asked, send them to us. We will make the recording available. But yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a really lovely session today. And I guess next time we have Mariana Mazzucato, but that's in July, which is a very different approach, but we're all aiming for the same thing. So Thank you for being here, and thank you, Bill, again.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Bye.